Okay, so our next speaker is Noelia Barrios-Garcia, who is a field ecologist, lecturer, and researcher in the Rubenstein School at UVM, and is interested in invasive species, climate change, and their effects on community composition and associated ecosystem processes, as well as finding ways to assist in predicting and mitigating their impacts. She has studied a wide range of invasive species in Patagonia, Argentina, including pines, yellow jacket wasps, wild boar, deer, and cattle. She is currently researching knotweed and has been part of the efforts to eradicate knotweed in the Mad River Valley. The title of her talk today is From Invasion to Restoration, Managing Japanese Knotweed in the Mad River Valley. So give her a round of applause. Thank you. And here's this to control.
All right, but we don't see it yet. So, oh yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for having me and for the invitation here. I'm happy to be here and tell you a little bit about me and what I do. And thank you for the introduction, which is great, and it's a good intro to say I'm an invasion ecologist. So I'm going to talk a lot about what invasive species are and how do we manage them and what are the impacts. This is mostly, I think, review for all of you because you are experts, managers and practitioners in the field. But then we're going to pivot and talk a little bit more about what we've been doing in the Mad River Valley. And I know Kurt presented last year, so some of you know already a little bit about that work. But today I'm going to share some data that we've been collecting. And that would be my plug for the day, that we need to collect data when you do things. All right, so quick review here. Maybe this is going to work. All right. So as you all know, native species are very different from introduced species. So just reviewing some concepts here. Introduced species are species that we move around the world because we like them, because we need them. We identify them as species that are transported by humans. It could be accidentally or intentionally introduced. And as they get into this new location, they establish there. Many times, those introduced species actually are not problematic because they rely on humans for persistence. So there are many things that we move, crops, species that we have as like exotic animals around our properties or plants in our backyards. But invasion ecologists are not worried about introduced species. There are thousands of introduced species that are not a problem, but a really tiny proportion of those introduced species become invasive species. And that's what invasion ecologists study. So invasive species are introduced species that, in contrast to the other introduced species, sustain growing population sizes, and those populations can cause harm on the environment, on the economy, or the health. So I want to emphasize here that it's a small proportion of the introduced species that become invasive. It's actually estimated that only 1% of all the things that we move around the world become invasive. Part of my next couple of slides will focus on what do we mean that they have sustainable growing populations and impacts on the environment, economy, and health. And so here I have like two of the many invasive species that are present in the US that have like these really dramatic increases in population size. In the top left for you, you can see kudzu, which is a very common species in the southeast of the US. It was introduced intentionally to reduce soil erosion after road work. It was a perfect vine, as you can see in that picture. It covers the soil, so it was introduced to reduce soil erosion. But as you know, it went wrong, the introduction, and became a very problematic species in the southeast. Now here on the bottom left, we have a photo of zebra mussels, which are very common in Lake Champlain and all the Great Lakes and other major rivers in the US. That species actually came accidentally in ballast water in ships that move stuff around between Europe and the Americas, and became one of the most dominant mollusks in many freshwater systems, and they not only affect the environment, but they also affect pipes where we used to take water from rivers and lakes, but also sewage, dark waters, I guess, back to the aquatic system. So invasive species have these really high populations numbers. And these high numbers cause, as I mentioned, environmental changes or some harm on the environment, on the economy, and health. So when we say they cause harm on the environment, there is now a large group of invasion scientists that have compiled all the impacts that they cause. There are some positive impacts of invasive species on the ecosystems, but generally speaking, all of the reported impacts are negative, and they affect, they change ecosystems, they predate, or they eat native species, both plants and animals. They compete with native counterparts, and so they affect the native environment. But they are also linked as a source or as a cause of extinction. So together with other drivers of change, habitat loss or climate change, it is estimated that invasive species are involved in 60% of all the recorded extinctions around in the world, and they are the sole cause of extinction of about 16% of all the species that we lost. So for all these reasons that I mentioned, invasive species are now considered the second biggest threat to biodiversity. And in this slide, you can see many invasive species that are common, very common throughout the US. I always like to include also in my slide a beaver dam, beavers are not invasive here. Actually, everybody wants beavers again back in this part of the world. But they were introduced in Argentina for the fur industry. And so in southern Argentina and Chile, they are a very nasty invasive species that we want to get rid of. And so this is something that's in my mind all the time, how different, the context is very different, where the species is native or introduced, and how to balance those contrasting, I guess, interests in bringing back a species sometimes in their ecosystems, but then being highly problematic elsewhere. So as I mentioned, invasive species are not only an environmental problem, they cause a large amount of economic loss. The Intergovernmental Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services produced a document in 2023 where focusing mostly on invasive species, or that document was on invasive species, and they estimated that the economic cost of invasive species now reaches about $423 billion a year. And that value is actually has quadrupled. The economic cost has quadrupled in the past every decade. So this number, I know, might seem like ridiculously high for invasive species, but we have to keep in mind that many of the invasive species that we are managing around the world are actually pests, right, or weeds in crops. So that's why this number is so big. Here, I have some numbers of the the 100 worst invasive species out there, but also many others and that affect humans. And so again, similar to the impacts on biodiversity, it is estimated that about all the impacts that they cause on ecosystem services, invasive species are related to like 80% of the negative effects on these ecosystem services. And then lastly, invasive species are also could cause harm on health. And the reason is because many times they host or they spread a number of diseases that affect both wildlife and livestock and humans. Here, as just a brief example, I have the Asian tiger mosquito, which is introduced in many places around the world. And as you know, these species host many diseases like malaria, dengue, Zika, and yellow fever, which affects humans. And they can cause an estimated deaths of between 700 to 1 million people a year. So a very clear, quick review on all these aspects that invasive species are problematic, but something that as invasion ecologists we ask a lot is why a species become invasive in the first place, right? We are moving them, but remember that only about 1% of all the invasive species that we move become problematic, and a lot of the work to prevent the impact of invasions is trying to identify which ones will become problematic so that we prevent the movement of those species in the first place. So there are many hypotheses actually explaining why invasive species become invasive. In this figure, you can see each of those circles represent a different hypothesis. These hypotheses are grouped depending on whether you are focusing on traits of the invasive species or characteristic of the recipient habitat or interactions between different components or evolutionary histories of the different species. So today I wanted to highlight just two of those hypotheses that are most well known to explain why some invasive species become invasive. But then again, I want to bring this to you so that you can think, if you're working on an invasive species, you can think about, what are the traits or the factors that are allowing this species to become invasive? And identifying those mechanisms are key to understand how to manage those species too. All right, so one of these hypotheses is the enemy release hypothesis that states that the absence of natural enemies is the cause of success of invasive species. And a quick example here is the introduction, for example, of brown tree snakes in Guam. This species was introduced by accident into Guam. And because the snakes don't have any natural enemy in Guam, their populations went really high. But then, simultaneously, this is another explanation why they are so successful there, is that none of the native species were adapted to such a predator. So finding food resources was very easy for the snakes. On the figures here on your left, I don't expect you to read all the labels there, but basically I'm showing through time, each of those panels are looking at the abundance of different birds, native birds. And what one has seen since the introduction back in 1950s is that many species are now locally extinct because snakes have easy food access there in that island. So another hypothesis that I wanted to visit and is related to this island example is the biotic resistant hypothesis, which states that ecosystems that have high biodiversity are actually more resistant to invasion. And those places that have lower biodiversity will have more chances of invasion. So a lot of the literature out there, actually, when you think about invasive species, the invasions are very successful on islands because the diversity of a species, usually in islands, because the area is smaller, is like less number of species, and that opens niches for invasive species to establish. Now, this hypothesis started thinking about islands, but then it was tested in different systems. And here I'm showing data from really combined, actually, data set looking at plant diversity in different forest plots, actually, across the US, in different systems. Actually, there's surveys on the other side here. I'm getting intrigued too. There's forest plots and herbaceous plots and shrubland plots and woodland plots. And so what you see overall is that as the number of species, native species increase, then the chances that invasive species can establish go down. Okay, and notice this on the x-axis is a weird scale, it's a log scale, but it's just to be able to combine sites that have very different diversity. But the pattern is, again, the more native biodiversity, less chances of invasive species to establish. Again, there are many hypotheses. I'm going to touch on one more as we move on to the case of the Japanese knotweed. But it is important to think about all these factors because they help us understand why species are invasive in different systems. But the main point I wanted to say is that clearly, with all the stuff that I just described, invasive species are a problem, and we need to do something, right? We need to stop the spread, and we need to manage their populations. And so that's my main research. For most of my time, I actually focus on understanding what are the impacts of invasive species on community structure and ecosystem function. I did a lot of work down in Argentina, but then also some work now in the US, mostly with animals for some reason, but I have a lot of projects now with plants too. More recently, since I actually moved to Vermont, I've been working more and more on understanding the socioeconomical impacts of invasive species and also how to manage them. This photo is actually down from Patagonia looking at disturbance of wild boar, and the park rangers there were setting up traps actually to catch them and reduce abundances in wetland areas that are heavily affected by them, as you can see in that photo. But moving on to the knotweed example that I'm now working here in Vermont. Knotweed is native to Asia, East Asia, and it was introduced in the US intentionally as an horticultural plant, ornamental plant, and became invasive since then. As you can see in the map, it was introduced in the US, but it's also very widely spread in Europe, where also there's a longer history of invasion there and very problematic. And more recently in Australia, New Zealand, and now in Chile, which is unfortunate, small spots there, but it will probably become as problematic as it is over here. So I'm sure most of you are familiar with this. So again, like very quickly, this plant forms these like big seedlets that compete with native vegetation. They especially likes growing near streams and water bodies or river banks. But it also has, these novel traits that makes them, especially in this ecosystem. One of them is that they produce these, knotweed produce these allelochemical compounds. So these are chemical compounds. Many plants produce allelochemical compounds, like coffee, for example. Caffeine, it's an allelochemical compound. Usually they are designed for species. They produce these secondary metabolites to reduce the pressure of natural predators like herbivores. And also they can be used to reduce competition with other plants growing in the system. So it's not a bad thing that it has that trait, but it's the key, one of the key traits that allows the plants to become really widespread and so successful in these habitats. My next slide doesn't have any, okay, there we go. There's the whole photo thing. So the other trait that is important about knotweed is that it has a very shallow rooting system, and it changes riverbank stabilization. They collapse way more frequently, especially after flooding events. Here you can see a set of photos. So it causes a lot of environmental impacts, but it's also, there are some implications for communities around these areas, as we see higher frequency of storms and flooding events. Having an invasive species such as Japanese knotweed on the riverbanks is problematic. So there's been a lot of research on what are the impacts of these invasive species. So we're not doing that here in Vermont. We're focusing more on understanding how to manage it. So just as a quick introduction here on management strategies vary a lot depending on the stage of invasion of the species. So in this figure, you can see on the x-axis is time, and on the y-axis, you can see the amount of area that is impacted by an invasive species. And as you can see, if we could describe that invasion stages, right? If the species is not there, is absent, there is no area impacted, but as time goes by and the abundance grows, increases, then the species start spreading and then becoming more widespread, and the area impacted is increasing, right? And so the management really changed depending on that stage. So in early stages, when the species is not present actually at all, you want to prevent invasion, right? So regulations like, controls on what you're moving around, what nurseries are selling, and all of those things that, allow the introduction of invasive species. So there are different scales, of course, to prevent the movement of invasive species and levels of control. But once a species is introduced in a new location, it is important to have this early detection monitoring efforts or surveys, so that if it gets to a new location, you can act very quickly and eradicate the species. Now, the truth is that, of course, the abundance is very low, and it's really hard to detect the species in the earliest stages. And so the window to act very quickly is very short. And so we tend to notice species when they start spreading and they become more obvious. So the strategies there start shifting. You want to prevent further spread, so you focus more on containment management. And then when species are really widespread, then you want to do control, you want to do restoration, but mostly focusing on specific areas where you have conservation priorities, for example. So another important thing about understanding the stage of invasion is understanding the efficiency of management. As time goes by, the efficiency of management, of course, goes down. Preventing that the species is going to be in the ecosystem is impossible. And also the cost of managing that species will grow. And that's why it's very important, actually, to invest more efforts in trying to detect the species very quickly and deal with them before they become problematic. And also you target the management effort at different levels. So early stages, you focus on the pathways of invasion. When the species is present, you want to focus on managing the species itself. But then as it is widespread, then you want to focus on the bigger sites and catchment, or managing whole ecosystem. And this brings me to the study system that we're working here, the Mud River Watershed. And working on this at the watershed level is ideal because you have these natural boundaries of the systems that you're managing that makes your management more efficient, right? And you wanna, as you know, this species is spread by waterways, and so by working at the watershed system, you are more successful with your management strategies. And so I want to highlight here that all this work actually started with Kurt Lindbergh, who is here, Gito Coleman, and Andrea Henderson. They are the conservation commissioners of 3 towns in the Mud River Valley, Waitsfield, Warren, and Fayston. And they've been working on this project for the past 8 years. I'm actually recently added to the project as an invasion ecologist to help them guide some research projects, but also data collection and understanding whether their efforts are successful or not. And I have 4 minutes, and I don't know how I'm going to go through all of this. But the first thing they did is that they map a lot of where knotweed was present in the valley. And then there are different methods of controlling invasive species. There's mechanical methods, control, chemical control, and biological control. In the Mud River Valley, chemical control was not an option. It was mostly, they are focusing on mechanical management and now biological management, as they are using goats to tackle areas that are completely overtaken by Japanese knotweed. And here are some results that I wanted to share with you, because they set up a 3x3 series of 3x3 plots in several of the locations that they are managing, and they've been collecting data. So this is the important message here for all of you managers and practitioners. When you do stuff, collect data. It's very simple to set up a 3x3 plot and then monitor how things are going. They are very informative in what you want to do next. So here's the data. Over the past 3 years, the number of stems of knotweed have decreased by 50%. Here is data from the past 3 years, 23, 24, and 25. Also, the cover of knotweed had decreased by 20% on those same plots. Cover meaning the area, the percentage area of that 3x3 plot. In the same plots, the interns that are working with us have measured stem diameter, and we have observed a decrease in stem diameter by 50%. So there are fewer stems, there is less growth in terms of cover, and the plants are less vigorous as the stems is smaller, okay? Now they also look at responses of plant communities, and we're not seeing any significant change yet on native richness, though it seems like it might be increasing. More data will help over time. But the other thing is that we're observing is that many invasive species are also growing on those plots. And we've seen an increase in 50% of the number of invasive species. In the past year, we were interested in understanding whether cutting or digging is more efficient than just mixing all the methods. And so we set up a whole new set of plots dividing these treatments, different treatments, if it's digging or just cutting. And the results are very similar. And I'm going to go through this very quickly, but we're also seeing a decline, regardless of the method that you can see down here, cutting or digging. We see that knotweed is decreasing a lot. It looks like maybe with a bigger effect on digging plants than just cutting. But the number of crowns decline, the stem diameters also decline by 70%, and the numbers of native species didn't change as much. This is only 1 year data, though, so it might change as we collect more and more more data. But again, invasive species seem to be, coming in very quickly. So one thing that we always discuss with all the team is that removing the invasive species does not necessarily, translate to ecosystem recovery, because we see a lot of these secondary invasions. And this is when restoration becomes really important. It's how do we really restore, right? Removing the species is part of it, but it's not the whole thing. So Kurt and company actually have been planting a lot of trees. And so I like to see all these other presentations today because I'm thinking like we should start monitoring how these trees are doing. But then another thing that we've been discussing, and many of you notice, is that trees, take a long time to grow, and sometimes they die, and it takes a while to cover, right? It takes years to cover the ground, and so we want to start working on recovering the understory layer to prevent other invasions. A lot of the invasions that we get are herbaceous plants. So with some of the interns that have been working with us in the past year, we started a few experiments. This one is in the greenhouse. We did some work in the field too, trying to identify native species, herbaceous ones and grasses, that could quickly, grow on those spores, like early successional, I guess, to take over area and then maybe compete with knotweed. But because of those nasty chemicals that they produce, it is important to test which ones would do best. So last slide here, I'm going to stop with this one, is that, adaptive management is very important. I think you guys mentioned this earlier today. I had to walk out for classes, but in order to inform your management strategies, it's very important to collect data. So I'm going to highlight that part a lot. In part of the circle here is that you need to, make a plan, then establish your monitoring program, and then collect data. And that will inform how you can adjust your new iteration, right, when you manage the next time. And that's the part that I like doing the most, actually, analyzing data and saying, we need to do. And with that, I think I'm going to wrap it up because I don't want to go too much over time, but thank you so much for listening. And come talk to me afterwards.
Great. Well, we're switching over. We can take maybe one question. Noelia.
Thank you so much for this work. It's really great. I've been involved with invasives in a few different capacities, one with the conservation districts. I'm also working with conservation commissions. I know that there are some really strong opinions about what tools are used to manage them. And so I'm curious, one of the big concerns I hear from communities around chemical management is how long those chemicals may or may not stay in the soil. You mentioned the allelopathic chemicals that these plants naturally produce. Are you aware of any studies for how long those chemicals remain in the soil?
That's a great question. Some of my most recent work is focusing on legacy effects. That's what it's called. How long signals last. And my first work on this topic is actually with invasive yellow jackets down in Argentina because they have underground nests. And as the colonies die, they release a lot of nutrients in the soil, and they create these like fertility islands with a signal that lasts more than 2 years and a half, 3 years actually. One PhD student now is looking into that, but nobody, or not that I know of, anyone has looked at like how long the allelochemical compounds of the Japanese knotweed last in the soil. So that's something that's an avenue that I'm interested in exploring here. The tricky part with that is that it requires some equipment that I don't have access to, but I could potentially find collaborators because identifying these chemicals, it requires like equipment that is highly specialized. And there are a whole suite of allelochemical compounds. It's not that like, I measure this one and then I know the whole thing, but it would be nice to be able to measure over time and see how long that lasts. Yeah, good question. I don't know the answer. All right, I think we're up to time, but I'm happy to talk more.